read a story recently of a Cuban husband and wife who in the 60s spent years assembling scrap metal, welding it together to make a kayak. They got a lawnmower motor, put it on the back of it, and after it was all assembled, they put it in the water and braved hundreds of miles in the open sea to get to Florida. For what reason? To escape a totalitarian regime and to experience something closer to freedom. Freedom. It's something that's wired within us. Like as human beings, we desire freedom. I mean, it's not just an American thing where we have life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, life, liberty, freedom. It's definitely an American thing, but it's a human thing. We desire freedom. We spend our money on time to go to seminars that help us how to experience like financial freedom or emotional freedom or psychological freedom or any type of freedom. We spend our energy on it, trying to move past the things that obstruct our path towards freedom. We read books about it. Some of the most popular, most sold books deal with some type of like potential freedom that we could experience by just reading the book and putting the ideas into practice. We resist cravings for drink and food and spending so that we could experience something close to freedom. We resist the things that we want because we think that freedom is on offer if we resist them. Like we spend our energy on this kind of stuff. I remember when I was in junior high, we had a political candidate, somebody who was running for office, a local office, come into one of our classes and give her spiel about what she was running for office for. We booed her out of the classroom so quick. And it was for this reason, because she was running on this idea that in part the driving age should be moved to 18. Now we were 15 years old in that classroom, and there's no way that someone was going to deprive us of what our freedom. We wanted to get a car and drive as fast as we could, and we booed her out of the classroom because of it. A friend recently confided in me. He shared something that he'd been holding back, something that was weighty for him. He told me this thing that had been weighing him down, and after he shared it, I said, "How do you feel?" And he said, "I feel so free." Well, we're doing this teaching series called Church and City. And the question that we're asking is, what does it look like for a church to show up in a city? And what kind of impact does the church have on the city? How does the city change because the church is there? Now, we're doing this for a few reasons. One, because at Anchor, we care about living for the good of the city. We don't think that a church should just care about itself. We want to make a positive impact on the neighborhoods and on the city as a whole, and in the South Sound here in this beautiful place we live. But also, we're in the process of planting our first church. If you've been around Anchor for a while, you know that we were a church plant. We moved in to Tacoma and planted Anchor, and we have always wanted and desired and reached for, aspired towards planting more churches. So we're on the verge of doing that. And so for all of us here in the Anchor community, we're wanting us to think through, pray through, wrestle with what it looks like to be a church living for the good of the city. And one of the things that we come across through looking through our text today is that the church, in Acts chapter 16, the passage that we're going to look at, brings freedom to people. Brings freedom. This human craving, this thing that you could even say God has put within us, a desire for freedom. When the church shows up in the city, they facilitate that freedom. So, like I said, we're going to be looking at Acts chapter 16. We're going to be looking at a large portion of this chapter. But to set it up, Paul and Silas are on this missionary journey. They're going to places farther and farther away from Jerusalem and Judea, bringing the good news of Jesus and the good works that are part of the way of Jesus to these different places around the Europe and the ancient Near East. And they sail into this area called Philippi, the city called Philippi, in the area of Macedonia. And the first type of freedom that we see that is on offer is what we're calling the freedom to belong. This is the first type of freedom that the church, Paul and Silas, offer to someone in the city, the freedom to belong. We'll pick it up in verse 13. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place of prayer. Typically in an ancient or first century city, if there were Jews in a city, but not enough Jews to get a synagogue, they would meet at the river to pray. And it says, we sat down and began to speak to the women who were gathered there. And one of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. And she was a worshiper of God. And the Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. Now, what we know about Lydia was that she had means, incredible means. In fact, many say that you could only be a dealer in purple cloth if you were somehow connected through a familial bond with the emperor himself. We don't know that for a fact, but it's many believe that to be. So Lydia was probably potentially connected to the most powerful person in the Roman Empire through a familial bond. And if that wasn't true, she at least had a lot of means, because to deal in purple cloth meant was this kind of, it was the essential, it was this like really high respected, wealthy trade position. We don't know if she was a single woman or if she was a widow, but she was basically this entrepreneurial, well-connected, established woman living in the city of Philippi. But even like though she had all these means, there was this interesting relationship she had with the community that she wanted to be a part of. You see, what we know about Lydia was that she was not a Jewish person, but she was, as described here in Acts chapter 13, a worshiper of God. In the early, or in the first century, and really with the exile from the Jews leaving Jerusalem and being spread out throughout the Roman Empire, throughout Europe, and throughout the Middle East, there was synagogues set up all throughout the area. And oftentimes, people that weren't Jewish would become interested in the teachings of the Old Testament and the way of Yahweh. And so they would lean in, and they were actually described as God-fearers. They were not ethnically Jewish, but they were interested and wanted to be a part of the community. But there was this gap between their ability to do so and their interest and desire to experience it. And because they weren't ethnically Jewish, they were always kind of insiders and outsiders. And so for Lydia, there wasn't exactly a glass ceiling. She had the means, she had the capital, she had the connections, she had the respect of the people in her town, but there was a glass wall. There was this thing that was keeping her from being a total insider in this community, which was significant for Paul and Silas to meet her, because what they told her was, hey, your ethnicity is not a barrier towards your participation in this community. In fact, Jesus died for all. His message is for all. It's for you. You can come in. There's no walls of division. You can have the freedom to belong. Dan Siegel, clinical psychologist and writer, professor, says this. He says that we're all born looking for someone to look for us. You catch that? That from birth, we have this longing to be seen by another. We want to know that we belong. It's from birth. So we're looking around as who's the person that's going to care for me, that's with me. This is something that is irrespective of age and gender and ethnicity, the time you were born. It's something very human. We have a hunger to belong. Another Christian counselor says this as the primary questions that all humans ask, irrespective of religion or creed or anything like that, is who am I? Who are my people? And what do my people do? That second question there illustrates this need we have to belong. Who are my people? This is what Lydia is like wrestling with as she experiences all of this freedom in all areas of her life, except for the fact that there's this barrier towards being fully a part of the community that she wants to be a part of. And here Paul is saying that you are invited to become a full-fledged member to experience belonging. Here at Anchor, for a long time, we still use it, not as much as we did at the beginning. We would say over and over again, you can belong before you believe. We really like that. We think that's true. Like, you can belong in this community. You can find your people even as you're wondering, okay, where am I at with this whole Jesus thing? This is kind of just how life works. You think about like the disciples, how Jesus brings the disciples into belonging, even as the disciples are trying to figure out like what it looks like to believe in this guy who is their rabbi, and they're finding that he's so much more. Belief grows in the context of belonging. Lydia, what she desires, she actually already believes, but what she desires is this belonging. What happens is when you create a community where you know that you belong and you can invite someone else to belong, even as they're sorting out all the stuff that they're wrestling with, there's this freedom that comes with that. And this is what the church does. This is what the church does to Lydia, and when it shows up here in the city of Philippi, it gives people the freedom to belong. I love it. Closes with this in this section where it talks about Lydia. It says, when she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. If you consider me a believer of the Lord, she said, come and stay at my house. Do you see how this belonging is reciprocal? As she knows she's a part of the community, as she says, come in to stay with me. There's this beautiful back and forth flow where she's inviting people in, and she's invited God into her heart, and she knows she's a part of this community, and she wants to be a person that offers belonging to others, even as she's found belonging herself. This is a freedom that she's experiencing that she hadn't before. And as the story goes on, we see another freedom show up, what I'm calling the freedom to live. Just the freedom to live. In verse 16, we read, once when we were going to the place of prayer. So Paul and Silas and they've been, and presumably Luke, they've been there for a number of time. They're continually going down to this place of prayer by the river. And we don't know how much time has elapsed, but they're going down there. Once when we're going to the place of prayer, we were met by a female slave who had a spirit by which she predicted the future. And she earned a great deal of money, not for herself, but for her owners by fortune telling. She followed Paul and the rest of us, shouting, these men are servants of the Most High God, who are telling you the way to be saved. She kept this up for many days. And finally, Paul became so annoyed that he turned around and said to the spirit, in the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to come out of her. And that moment, the spirit left her. In verse 19, it says, when her owners realized that their hope of making money was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to face the authorities. Did you catch that? When they realized their potential, their hope of making money was gone. This is like a crazy passage. Paul and Silas are going to church, and there's this all of a sudden this woman who's a slave who is possessed by an evil spirit and commodified by her masters so that her masters can get money, and she doesn't get any of the reward from it. And Paul gets annoyed Right? It says Paul gets frustrated by her like telling something that is more or less true, that these guys are, followers of the Most High God telling, it's like, this is a crazy story. And then Paul exorcises the demon. It's a crazy passage. But one thing we see is at the end of it, this young girl is free. No longer is she at the mercy of the enemy or the corrupt slave owning couple. She's free. Well, I like to think, and admittedly, this is my imagination, but I like to think, like, what caused her to keep following Paul and Silas? Even as she was, in slavery to her masters and in a spiritual slavery to this spirit, I wonder if a part of her was longing for the freedom that she knew was potentially available through the power of God working through Paul and Silas. Where did she meet them? She met them as Paul and Silas were going to that place of prayer. She knew where they were going. She was following. She saw it. She was there long enough to watch, and she just followed for days. I imagine, admittedly, again, my imagination, that she was crying out for freedom. What I love about this passage, too, is it doesn't separate, spiritual freedom and like actual, like physical, relational freedom. I think at different times in the church, and through the history of the church, we've focused on like, like spiritual freedom and being free from oppressive spiritual forces. And we've made the spiritual component of freedom something that is the primary focus. And other times in the church, we focused on real relational, like real present, tangible, like social freedom. And we've made social issues a focus, and made the freedom from the oppressive social issues something that we've drawn our attention to. And one of the things that I love about this passage is that it actually focuses on both at the same time. It focuses on this need for spiritual freedom, and it focuses on the need for actual, like, social, relational, real life, touch it, feel it freedom. And what happens is, as a result of this, is that she's no longer possessed by the spirit, and she's no longer possessed by the corrupt masters. She has, because of this, interesting as it is, incident, how she is freed in this way. Interesting as it is, she's freed to live. I think all of us, experience like a hunger for a measure of this. You might not feel, you may not experience it to the level that girl needed it. You might not be in that desperate of a situation, but no doubt that you experience a need, a freedom, a desire to actually just live. For a lot of my life, I've wrestled with insecurity, and I haven't really hidden that, in teachings on Sunday mornings here at Anchor, because it's like a part of my story and my journey. In fact, I have this tattoo on my on my arm that has a tombstone that says insecure, just signifying that, like, I don't need to be insecure. That way of life is dead. I remember, just an example of this, of my experiencing it. I remember when I worked at Starbucks while going to seminary, I would be counting the till in the back room, so counting the monies, counting the money up, and then if somebody would walk in, I just would freeze up, and I'd feel like I was doing something wrong, even though I wasn't doing something wrong. Like, because I'm just like carrying this anxiety, this anxious energy, this insecurity with me, and somebody walks in, and I'm like, oh, I'm back here with money by myself. I must be doing something wrong, even though I'm consciously aware that I'm just counting my till. I was carrying this insecurity along with me, and like, what did I hunger for? Like, in the high moments of that, and the low, and the feeling like it's gone, I just wanted that freedom to live. When Jesus followers show up in the city of Philippi, they like, whether it's Lydia or the slave girl, they give freedom to this slave girl. They give her the freedom to live. She wakes up the next day not controlled by an antagonistic, demonic force. She wakes up the next day, clear-eyed, not having to report back to her corrupt masters that only value her insofar as she can produce money for them. She wakes up being able to make her own decisions about what she's going to do, not controlled by something else. What I imagine, again, this is my imagination. What I imagine is that because she had followed Paul and Silas for so long, she knew about Lydia. And so what I imagine is that she found her way to Lydia, who had also experienced a measure of freedom. And Lydia said something like, "This is how you sell purple cloth." I just, again, in my imagination, we don't know the answer to this, but like, could you imagine that because she actually spent days following Paul and Silas, she knew something about the Christian community, and when she experienced the power that was available through God working through this Christian community, she actually hungered for a connection with that Christian community. And in that Christian community that was housed in the church, the house of Lydia, as we'll find out a little bit later, she met Lydia, this woman of notoriety and means, and this woman of notoriety and means who had experienced belonging, invited this slave girl into belonging. The next bit of freedom we see is the freedom to experience joy. Verse 25 reads, "About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them." You see, they were put in prison because they exorcised the demon from this slave girl. So the slave girl was of no consequence to her masters. And so the masters got angry, started this campaign to get them put in jail. Paul and Silas got beat with rods and got like harmed. And then they got put in jail. And what were they doing? About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. What? What, you got the scar still on your body? You got purple arms and a bleeding back, and you're singing? People are interested. They're leaning in. They're listening. And suddenly there was such a violent earthquake. The foundations of the prison were shaken. At once all the prison doors flew open and everyone's chains came loose. The jailer woke up, and when he saw the prison doors open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, because he thought the prisoners had escaped. But Paul shouted, "Don't harm yourself. We're all here." You catch that? That jailer, he was about to end his life because it was better to close the curtain than face his failure. You know, when fear dominates our life, when fear of having to face our own shame or our own failure, when that dominates our life, we go non-relational. We get fixated on problems. We start waiting for people and problems just to go away rather than being proactively engaging and resolving them. We find the inability to imagine relational solutions for problems when we feel isolated and alone. This is the absence of freedom. It's the absence of joy. This is what this jailer is facing. You experience a negative emotions more intensely than you would otherwise do it. I remember in 2015, the story broke of Volkswagen lying about their emissions on their cars that are supposed to be lower emissions. They were lying about it. A whistleblower blew the whistle, and they admitted to underreporting carbon dioxide emissions, 800,000 diesel and gasoline-powered cars in Europe. And what was interesting, in a couple pieces that followed that up, was that the reason they underreported those numbers is because there was this culture of fear in the Volkswagen organization at the time. where there were these mandates from higher up levels of leadership that they had to hit certain numbers. And they was such a dominating, we need to do this, that people just started twisting and manipulating the numbers to hit the goals that they never really hit. Why? Because they were afraid that if they faced their failure, they would not have really any sense of self. It was better to manipulate and lie than have to face their failure. This is fear-driven leadership. This is a fear-driven approach to life. And as long as we, just in our personal lives, in our communities, as long as we think our life and our worth depends on our performance and our status, and it's only determined by what we can do, we will be tempted either to take a shortcut or just to settle into this joyless life where fear is normal. It doesn't have to be the case. You see, this jailer is interrupted. He's interrupted. His honor, shame, saving face, about to solve the problem with the means he knows how at that moment, even though it's drastic. It's interrupted by Paul. And Paul says, hey, don't do it. We're all here. And then the jailer says, well, what do I have to do to be saved? I love that word, because the commentators say that, what do I have to do to be saved isn't necessarily a theological question. In the Greek, it's like, what do I have to do to be saved, to experience relief from the potential, things I would have to face if you guys all ran away? He wants to probably experience a level of just job safety. That what do I have to need to be saved from this mess of a situation that I'm somehow implicated in? But Paul answers with a spiritual reply. He says, believe in the Lord Jesus and you'll be saved, you and your household. And then they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all others in the house. And at that hour of the night, the jailer took them and washed their wounds. This is the jailer that was either involved or saw the cause of their wounds. Now he's washing their wounds. And immediately, he and all his household were baptized. The jailer brought them into his house and set a meal before them. He was filled with joy because he had come to believe in God, he and his whole household. He's freed from fear, a fear-dominated life that thinks the best option is to pull the curtain on my life so I don't have to face the problem. He's freed from that way of life that determines worth according to performance, and is freed from that, and he can experience joy. That's what it says there in verse 34. He was able to rejoice. He was filled with joy. That Greek word has a bodily component to it, where it's described as it's actually often seen as like jubilant joy. Like my arms are moving, my voice is raising, my heart is beating. I'm like filled with not just kind of like this quiet, joy that is subtle and behind the scenes. It's this expressive, powerful joy. So where the fear had dominated him and his heart would race and his shoulders tighten to protect him, his fear dominated, but now he's filled with joy. And rather than the effects of bodily fear, he's experiencing joy within his body. He's experiencing it. It's filled with joy. He's freed to experience joy. This is what the church does when it shows up in the city of Philippi. It brings belonging. It brings the freedom to live. It brings the freedom to experience joy in all these areas and all these places that did not feel freedom, and all these people that did not experience freedom. Here they're experiencing freedom. How? How? Because like when we saw how, but how do we become people like that? Yeah, because the recurring theme of the people that are experiencing this freedom is that they have all met Paul and Silas. Right? They've all come in contact with the followers of Jesus, which is pretty remarkable. That you, if you're a follower of Jesus watching this, if you're saying yeah, I'm a follower of Jesus, if you living in the city that you live in, whether it's in the South Sound here or someone else, you can be a person that gives people the freedom to belong. You have that potential. You have that power. If you're a follower of Jesus, it's on offer to you. You can help somebody find the freedom to live. You can have the help someone experience the freedom to experience joy. That this is something that, as being a followers of Jesus, the church in the city, that this doesn't just describe a past reality, but a present potential for us. But not only is it something that's available to us, that we get to be catalysts, ambassadors of freedom, but when we take a look at Paul and Silas's life, as they had this unshakable freedom themselves. Not only did Paul and Silas offer freedom to people that desperately needed it, hungered for it, but they themselves had an unshakable freedom that no one could take away. You get that? Even beaten and in jail, they're singing and telling people about the love of God. How do you find that level of freedom? That all of your external freedoms are taken away, but still you have this inner freedom that is not held captive, and nothing can take it away. No one can diminish it. No one can choke it out. The freedom is always there. How do you find that level of freedom? Well, they knew the secret. They knew the secret, that Jesus Christ had given up his freedom in being born in a manger, taking on human flesh, learning to walk, stumbling over words, feeling, when he could become aware of it, the frustrations of betrayal and letdown. Jesus Christ experienced the relinquishment of freedom, ultimately, where he endured his own loss of life. Why? So that he might give the freedom to belong and to live and to experience joy to everyone. Paul and Silas knew that. They didn't just know it, but they had experienced it. And because they had experienced it, they had a type of freedom that no one could take away. So Anchor, as we think about what it looks like to be the church in the city, know that we get to pass on freedom to people that are struggling, feeling like they're on the outside, not feeling like they're experiencing true life, deprived of joy. We get to pass on, through the power of the Spirit, freedom. And we also get to experience it ourselves. That gift, that invitation is open to you. The closing of this passage shows that Paul and Silas, they go back to the house of Lydia, and they meet with all the followers of Jesus that had said yes to following Jesus while Paul and Silas were in Philippi. And I imagine the jailer was there, and I imagine the slave girl was there, and I know Lydia was there, and I know countless others that had experienced freedom were there. And this is my heart for all of us here at Anchor, that as we gather together, online or in person, we would be people that sing songs and learn alongside each other of the freedom that God has given us.